Mistress was wearing a diamond necklace paid for by my salary. My mother-in-law was pouring her champagne, and my husband had just ordered me to go back to the kitchen and wash the dishes in front of 100 elite guests. They all thought I was going to break down and cry. Instead, I looked at my watch. I had exactly 40 minutes left before I destroyed all of their lives. So glassware, catching the amber light of overhead chandeliers. A ballroom in the heart of the financial district, leased for a small fortune. A guest list comprising the most influential investors, local politicians, and socialites in Julian's orbit. And at the center of it all, a husband physically pulling his wife away from her own seat at the head table. He leaned in, his fingers digging into my wrist, so hard the skin turned white beneath his grip. His voice dropped to a hiss that was meant to be private, but was loud enough for the first two tables to hear perfectly. "Servants do not sit with the guests, Elena," Julian whispered. "Go back to the kitchen. You are embarrassing me." The ballroom cracked open with silence. Forks hovered over porcelain plates. A jazz pianist in the corner stumbled over a chord, letting the final note die in the heavy, suffocating air. I did not struggle. I did not rip my arm away. I simply looked down at his hand on my wrist, then looked back up at his face. Julian's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed desperately on the entrance of the ballroom. Through the double mahogany doors walked Chloe, 26 years old, blonde hair styled into loose, expensive waves. She wore an emerald silk gown that cost exactly 3 times what Julian gave me for a monthly household budget. Chloe moved through the frozen room with the practiced, theatrical glide of a woman who believed she was starring in a romantic movie, a woman who believed she had already won the war. She walked directly to the head table. She pulled out the chair that Julian had just dragged me away from. She sat down, crossed her legs, and placed her glittering clutch next to the silver cutlery. She looked at me standing there in my plain dress and my catering apron, and she offered me a smile. It was a small, vicious smile. The smile of a thief who wants you to know she has the keys to your house. 2 seats down sat Beatrice, Julian's mother. Beatrice did not gasp. She did not look at me, standing by the swinging kitchen doors. Instead, the older woman reached across the table, picked up a folded linen napkin, and gently draped it over Chloe's lap. "You look absolutely radiant tonight, my dear," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "Thank you for coming to support Julian." 100 guests. Not a single person stood up. Not a single person objected. I stood by the kitchen doors. I wiped my damp hands on my apron. I had been awake for 72 hours. I had marinated the beef tenderloin, baked the artisan bread from scratch, and piped the frosting on the 4-tier dark chocolate cake while my husband slept. I had cooked a feast for 100 people because Julian had told me that a catered meal lacked the personal touch required to impress his new investors. I looked at the people eating the food I had made. I looked at the mother-in-law who had welcomed the mistress. I looked at Julian, who was now smiling, pouring a glass of vintage champagne for the woman in the emerald dress. Then, I looked toward the gift table against the back wall. Resting between a stack of wrapped boxes and a bottle of expensive scotch was Julian's leather attaché case. Vintage, Italian leather, secured with a brass combination lock. He took it everywhere. Looking at that briefcase, I smiled. It was not a sad smile. It was not the fragile smile of a broken woman trying to save face. It was the terrifying, quiet smile of an architect watching people move into a building she had already wired with explosives. Every person in that room thought they were witnessing the public execution of a naive, obedient wife. They were wrong. I was the only person in the building who knew exactly what was inside that briefcase. And I was the only person who knew that Julian's empire was to understand how a man becomes arrogant enough to humiliate his wife in front of 100 people. You have to understand how he was built. 5 years earlier, Julian Vance had been a junior corporate consultant wearing off-the-rack suits that did not fit his shoulders. I was a senior operations manager for a global restructuring firm. My entire career was built on entering failing companies, auditing their hidden flaws, and systematically dismantling the rot. I dealt in cold, hard facts. When Julian and I met, he told me that my mind was the sharpest thing he had ever encountered. He told me we were going to build an empire together. And we did. But only one of us actually did the lifting. When Julian decided to launch his own boutique advisory firm, I kept my demanding day job to pay our mortgage, fund his startup costs, and keep our health insurance. At night, After working 10 hours, I ran his back office. I balanced his ledgers. I drafted his initial client contracts. I mapped out his 5-year growth strategy. I possessed a terrifying competence, an ability to manage chaos so smoothly and invisibly that Julian simply assumed the absence of chaos was a result of his own natural genius. As the firm grew and the money started rolling in, Julian began to change. We moved to a larger house in a better zip code. Julian upgraded his car to a German import. He upgraded his wardrobe to bespoke tailoring. And then he upgraded his reality. Men like Julian do not want to be reminded of the women who held the ladder while they climbed. My presence became a mirror that reflected his original inadequacy. He began to resent my competence. He stopped asking for my advice on contracts. He started taking solo business trips. And he bought that vintage leather attaché case, guarding it with a paranoia that was entirely new. Then came Chloe. Chloe was a junior marketing assistant at a firm Julian collaborated with. She was exactly the kind of woman a man like Julian needed. She did not know how to read a balance sheet. She did not know that Julian used to panic over a missed utility bill. She only knew the polished, wealthy, powerful version of Julian Vance. She looked at him with a wide-eyed admiration of someone staring at a god. Julian was addicted to that admiration. It was a drug I could no longer provide, because I knew how the sausage was made. Chloe did not just want Julian. She wanted Julian's life. And more importantly, she wanted me to know she was taking it. Discovered by accident. A misplaced text message. A suspicious credit card charge. My husband's affair was discovered because the mistress actively wanted to be caught. Chloe thrived on drama. She possessed the specific, high-maintenance vanity of a woman whose entire self-worth is derived from being chosen over someone else. Being a secret was not enough for her. She needed the victory to be public. It started with small, deliberate provocations. I found a tube of coral pink lipstick rolled under the passenger seat of Julian's car. I did not wear coral pink. Julian claimed he had driven a female client to the airport, and it must have fallen out her purse. 2 weeks later, I found a blonde hair woven into the fabric of his wool coat, not resting on the surface, deliberately threaded into the buttonhole. A month after that, Julian came home from a weekend conference in Chicago. I unpacked his suitcase. Tucked inside his toiletry bag, right next to his shaving cream, was a pair of expensive lace underwear. Any normal woman would have marched downstairs, thrown the underwear in her husband's face, and demanded a divorce. But I'm not a normal woman. I am a corporate restructuring auditor. When I find a discrepancy, I do not scream at the receptionist. I go straight to the financial ledgers. Chloe won a screaming match. She wanted me to confront Julian, so he could call me crazy, jealous, and controlling. She wanted to force his hand, making him choose her over a hysterical wife. I refused to give her the script she had written. I threw the lace underwear in the trash, took out the garbage, and made Julian a cup of coffee. I smiled at him. I asked him how Chicago was. He lied to my face, drinking the coffee I poured for him, completely unaware that by choosing to remain silent, I had just upgraded his status from an unfaithful husband to an active target. Silence is not surrender. Silence is aiming. You do not fire until you have mapped the entire battlefield. The next day, while Julian was at the office, I began the audit of my own marriage. I pulled our joint bank statements. Nothing unusual. Julian was too smart to leave a direct financial trail in the accounts I had access to. But Julian had a blind spot. He believed that because he had locked me out of the business operations for the past year, I no longer understood how the architecture of his firm worked. He forgot that I was the one who built the foundation. I logged into the county clerk's public property database. I searched Julian's name. Nothing. I searched the name of his advisory firm. Nothing. Then, remembering the vanity of the woman who deliberately left her underwear in my house, I searched the name Chloe Thorne. The database loaded. 3 the brass lock according to the county public records. Chloe Thorne was listed as the co-director of a newly formed holding company called Apex Horizon LLC. That was interesting, but not illegal. Men buy their mistresses' businesses all the time. What made it lethal was the asset list attached to Apex Horizon LLC's preliminary filings. The holding company was currently in the 30-day processing window to absorb 4 parcels of prime commercial real estate in the downtown district. I recognized the addresses immediately. They were the 4 commercial properties Julian and I had purchased together over the last 5 years. Properties I had researched. Properties I had helped finance with my own logistics salary. Properties whose deeds were jointly held in our marital trust. Julian was not just cheating on me. He was systematically draining our marital assets, transferring millions of dollars of real estate into a shell company controlled by his 26-year-old mistress. In our state, transferring jointly held commercial assets to a third-party LLC requires verified, notarized spousal consent. I had never signed a spousal consent form, which meant Julian had forged my signature, and he had paid a corrupt notary to stamp it. I sat at my kitchen island, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The depth of the betrayal was so absolute it transcended anger. It became purely mathematical. Julian was planning to steal my past, my present, and my financial future, all while coming home every night and eating the dinners I cooked for him. I needed to see the physical documents. I needed the forged notary stamp. I knew exactly where they were. The vintage leather attaché case. Julian never let out his sight. He brought it to the dinner table. He took it into the bathroom while he showered. The brass combination lock was the only thing standing between me and the evidence of a felony. I bided my time. I played the loving, oblivious wife. I let Chloe continue her pathetic little provocations. A scented hotel soap left in his luggage. A receipt from a jewelry store crumpled in his pocket. I ignored all of it. I was hunting a whale. I did not care about the minnows. 2 weeks later, Julian made a mistake. He came home late after a client dinner, heavily intoxicated on expensive scotch. He stumbled into the living room, dropped the briefcase on the rug, and collapsed onto the sofa. He was asleep within minutes. I walked into the living room. The house was dead silent. I knelt beside the sofa. The attaché case was sitting upright. The brass combination dial was facing the glow of the street lamp outside the window. Julian was a creature of ego. He would never use a random string of numbers. He would use something significant to his own narrative of success. I reached out and gently touched the cold brass dials. I did not spin them blindly. I thought about the man sleeping on the couch. What was his favorite number? The date he founded his firm? I spun the dials. 0, 4, 1, 5. April 15th. The incorporation date of Julian Vance Advisory. I pressed the latch. It did not budge. I looked at Julian. He snored softly. I thought harder. If he was shifting assets to Chloe, maybe he used her birthday? No. Julian was too narcissistic to use someone else's data to secure his own wealth. Then it hit me. The ultimate display of his arrogance. I spun the dials again. 1, 1, 2, 8. November 28th. The exact date we had signed the lease on our very first cramped apartment. The apartment where I had worked until 2 in the morning building his business plan while he slept. He was using the anniversary of my sacrifice as the password to lock me out of my own money. I pressed the latch. A sharp, metallic click broke the silence. The case popped open. Inside, beneath a layer of mundane client folders, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out. I extracted the documents and laid them flat on the rug. There they were. The property transfer deeds. 4 of them. Transferring the entirety of our commercial portfolio to Apex Horizon LLC. I flipped to the last page. There was my signature, forged flawlessly, and right beside it, the official stamp of a licensed notary public. But there was something else in the envelope, something that made the air leave my lungs. It was a bank statement. It did not belong to Julian. It belonged to Beatrice, my mother-in-law. Beatrice had co-signed a personal loan for $85,000. The funds had been wired to a leasing office for a luxury penthouse downtown. The tenant on the lease was Chloe Thorne. My mother-in-law had not just turned a blind eye to the affair. She had actively financed it. She had paid for the penthouse where my husband was sleeping with another woman, while simultaneously coming to my house every Sunday to eat my food and criticize my housekeeping. I took out my phone. I photographed every single page. I captured the notary stamps, the forged signatures, the bank wire transfers. Then I placed the documents back into the envelope exactly as I had found them. I closed the briefcase. I spun the dials to lock it. I wiped my fingerprints off the brass with a microfiber cloth. I stood up. I looked down at Julian. He looked so peaceful, so confident, a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of ice water, and called a woman named Sylvia Sterling. Sylvia was a senior partner at a law firm that specialized in high net worth asset recovery and aggressive divorce litigation. She was a woman who dismantled arrogant men for a living. She answered on the second ring. Sylvia, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. I need an audit. And over the next 3 months, I constructed a masterpiece of deception. While Julian and Chloe were busy playing house in the penthouse his mother had financed, I was sitting in Sylvia Sterling's mahogany-paneled office, systematically wiring the explosives beneath their entire reality. The strategy was brutally simple. The forged property transfers, Sylvia explained, tapping a silver pen against the printed photographs of the documents. Because your signature was forged, the transfers are legally void. However, Julian filed the preliminary paperwork with the county to begin the 30-day processing window. So we stop it? I asked. Sylvia smiled. A sharp, predatory smile. No, Elena. We let the 30-day window expire. We let the county officially record the transfer of the properties into Apex Horizon LLC. I stared at her. We let him steal the assets. We let him commit the felony, Sylvia corrected. Right now, it's just an intent to defraud. Once the county records the deeds, it becomes a consummated act of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate malfeasance. The moment the ink dries on the county ledger, we strike. We file an emergency injunction in the state Supreme Court. We freeze Apex Horizon LLC. We freeze all of Julian's personal accounts. We lock up his entire firm's operating capital pending a criminal investigation. And Chloe? I asked. Sylvia adjusted her glasses. As the co-director of the LLC, Ms. Thorne will be listed as a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. She will be personally liable for the stolen assets. I leaned back in the leather chair. The cold arithmetic of it washed over me, replacing any lingering trace of heartbreak with the pure, exhilarating focus of a sniper finding her mark. When do we drop the hammer? Sylvia asked. I thought about the calendar. Julian's 40th birthday was exactly 6 weeks away. He had been planning a massive, catered gala in a leased ballroom to impress a new syndicate of venture capitalists. He had asked me to personally cook the entire menu to add a touch of domestic warmth for the investors. He was planning to let me exhaust myself feeding his professional network, only to blindside me with divorce papers later that week once the asset transfer was secure. Hold the injunction, I said. Have a process server ready. We dropped the hammer at his birthday party. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Julian grew impossibly arrogant. He took phone calls from Chloe in the hallway, not even bothering to lower his voice. One evening, while I was folding his expensive dress shirts in the bedroom, I heard him on speakerphone in his office. Is your wife going to be a problem at the party? Chloe's voice drifted down the corridor, laced with a familiar, entitled whine. I don't want her hovering around when I meet the investors. Julian laughed, a dry, dismissive sound that made my stomach turn. Elena? Please. She will be in the kitchen managing the catering staff. It's what she's good at. She won't even know you're in the room. I paused. I held a crisp, white shirt in my hands. I did not throw it on the floor. I folded the sleeves inward, perfectly aligning the cuffs, and placed it gently in his drawer. Let him laugh, I thought. The dead do not sixth the public execution, which brings us back to the ballroom. The jazz quartet was playing a nervous, erratic tune that failed to cover the heavy tension in the room. Chloe was sipping champagne at the head table, basking in the spotlight. Beatrice was patting Chloe's hand. Julian was leaning over, whispering something in Chloe's ear that made her throw her head back and laugh. I stood by the kitchen doors for 3 full minutes. My closest friend, Sarah, who had known me since college, walked up behind me. Sarah's face was pale with rage. Her hands were curled into tight fists. Elena, Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with fury. If you do not walk over there and dump that wine over his head, I swear to God I will do it for you. How are you standing here? How are you letting her sit there? I untied the strings of my catering apron. I folded the stained linen into a neat square and handed it to a passing waiter. Watch, I said simply. I walked into the dining room. I did not march toward the head table. I did not look at Julian or Chloe. I walked to a small, empty 2-person table situated in the far back corner of the room, near the coat check. It was the worst seat in the house. I sat down. I placed a linen napkin on my lap. I signaled a waiter and asked for a glass of sparkling water. The room watched me. A woman at table 4 leaned over and whispered frantically to her husband. An investor at table 7 set his fork down and turned his chair slightly to keep me in his peripheral vision. Silence has a gravitational pull. When someone refuses to react to a spectacular public humiliation, it forces the audience to carry the discomfort for them. David, a senior partner in investment firm Julian had been desperately courting for a year, stood up from his prime seat near the front. He picked up his plate and his wine glass. He walked across the hardwood floor, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the walls. He pulled out the empty chair across from me. "That tenderloin is the best thing I have eaten in a decade," David said quietly, his eyes assessing me with a new level of respect. "Do you mind if I join you?" I smiled. "Please do." Then Sarah stood up. She abandoned her seat at table 2 and dragged a chair over to my corner. Then came the wife of Julian's biggest client. Then the vice president of the local bank. Within 10 minutes, the power dynamic of the room physically shifted. Guests began migrating. Chairs scraped across the floor. Conversations rebuilt themselves around the small table in the back. What had been the worst seat in the house had suddenly become the absolute center of gravity. Julian noticed. He was mid-sentence with a local politician when he looked up and realized the space immediately around his head table had grown incredibly sparse. His eyes tracked across the room and found his wife. She was not crying in the kitchen. She was holding court, surrounded by the exact people he needed to impress. The smug confidence on Chloe's face faltered. She looked at Julian, then at the crowd gathering around the woman she had displaced. Beatrice stared at her untouched plate, her posture suddenly rigid. Julian tapped his knife against his crystal glass. The sharp ringing cut through the chatter. The room reluctantly turned back toward him. Julian stood up. He adjusted his suit jacket. He put on his best, most charismatic corporate smile. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he announced, his voice smooth and practiced. "This has been a milestone year for my firm. I want to thank my brilliant team. I want to thank my mother, Beatrice, for her unwavering belief in my vision." He paused. He gestured slightly toward the woman sitting next to him in the emerald dress. "And I want to thank Chloe for her incredible support and her sharp eye for the future." He raised his glass. He did not say my name. Not once. The woman who had built his foundation, who had balanced his books, who had spent the last 3 days cooking every morsel of food currently sitting in their stomachs, was erased from his narrative completely. A few people clapped. It was a thin, brittle, uncomfortable sound. Julian prepared to sit down. Before he, I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I rose from the table in the back of the room with the terrifying composure of a judge entering a courtroom. "If I may have a moment," I said. My voice was perfectly leveled, pitched just high enough to carry across the acoustic ceiling. Julian froze. His hand tightened around the stem of his wine glass. "Elena," he warned, a hard edge creeping into his tone. "We are moving on to the dancing. I want to thank you all for coming," I continued, ignoring him entirely. "I spent 3 days preparing the menu for tonight, and it brings me great joy to see that you enjoyed the meal." I stepped away from my table. I walked slowly up the center aisle. The crowd parted for me instinctively. "I also have a gift for Julian," I said. "Something I have been preparing for quite a while." Julian's eyes darted toward the exit. He looked like a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trapdoor. I reached the gift table. I picked up the vintage leather attaché case. Julian's face drained of color. The blood retreated from his cheeks, so fast he looked physically ill. "Elena," he said. The word was a warning. It was a plea. I turned the brass dial. 1, 1, 2, 8. The heavy click of the latch echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. I opened the case. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of paperwork. I did not throw it. I held it up, displaying the legal seals to the room. I spoke with the clinical precision of a surgeon operating on a tumor. "Over the last several months, my husband has attempted to transfer the entirety of our jointly held commercial real estate portfolio into a new holding company. A company code directed by Ms. Chloe Thorne, the woman currently sitting in my chair." A collective breath was drawn into the lungs of 100 guests. No one let it out. I turned to look at Beatrice. The older woman was gripping the edge of the table. Furthermore, the luxury penthouse, currently occupied by Ms. Thorne, was secured via an $85,000 personal loan, a loan co-signed by Julian's mother, Beatrice. Beatrice's hand flew to her pearls. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She looked around, desperately seeking an ally, but the faces staring back at her, the polite society friends she had cultivated for decades, were filled with pure, unfiltered disgust. Julian stepped forward, his panic finally overriding his common sense. "Elena, stop this right now. You are hysterical. You are drunk. Put those papers away before you ruin my career." "I'm not hysterical, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a temperature that froze the room. "I am audited." I reached into the case and pulled out a second stack of papers. "These are copies of an emergency injunction filed yesterday afternoon in the state Supreme Court. Because my signature was forged on the preliminary transfers, every document in this briefcase is legally void." I walked to the head table. Julian backed away from me as if I were holding a live grenade. I dropped the stack of legal injunctions onto the white tablecloth right in front of Chloe's plate. "As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, Apex Horizon LLC has been frozen pending a criminal fraud investigation regarding the forged notary stamps. All capital is locked. The assets revert to the original marital trust." Julian looked at the documents. He looked at the court seal. The reality of his situation collapsed over him like a falling building. "And finally," I said, looking directly into Julian's vacant, terrified eyes. From the back of the room, a woman in sharp gray suit stood up. Sylvia Sterling. She walked calmly down the aisle, holding a single manila envelope. She stopped in front of Julian. "Julian Vance," Sylvia said, her voice ringing with professional detachment. "You have been formally served with papers for divorce, asset dissolution, and a civil suit for financial fraud." Sylvia dropped the envelope onto Julian's chest. He didn't catch it. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Chloe shoved her chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood. She grabbed her designer clutch and practically ran toward the exit, her expensive emerald gown catching on the edge of the table and tearing. She did not look at Julian. She did not say a word. The moment the money was frozen, the grand romance was instantly terminated. Beatrice sat entirely paralyzed, staring at the shattered remains of her son's reputation and her own social standing. I looked at the man I had spent 10 years building. He had nothing to say. He had no angle left. The locks he had guarded so carefully were broken, and all his pathetic, arrogant secrets had been laid bare under the chandeliers. I turned my back on him. I looked at David, at Sarah, at the people who had moved their chairs for me. "Please, enjoy the cake," I said. I walked out the front doors of the ballroom and into the deletion. The destruction of Julian Vance did not happen overnight. It happened over 72 hours. The morning after the party, David called Julian's office. He formally withdrew his investment firm's backing from Julian's upcoming development project. When Julian tried to beg, David cut him off. "Julian, I ate food your wife spent 3 days cooking, and then I watched you try to banish her to the kitchen like a dog. There is absolutely nothing you could pitch me that I would ever trust." 2 other major clients followed suit by Wednesday. Julian's firm bled capital. The fraud investigation triggered a freeze on his personal accounts. Chloe, realizing she was listed as a co-conspirator on a fraudulent LLC, packed her bags, broke the lease on the penthouse, and vanished from the city. She left Julian a text message that simply said, "Do not contact me. My lawyer will handle this." Beatrice was quietly asked to step down from the board of her prestigious charity foundation. The board members cited a need for leadership with undisputed moral standing. She was not expelled. She was simply never invited to another meeting again. Julian lost the firm. He lost the house. He rented a small, sterile apartment on the outskirts of the city. One evening, 6 months later, he sent me an email. It was a long, pathetic apology, begging for a 5-minute phone call, begging for closure. I was sitting on the back patio of a 3-bedroom brownstone I had purchased outright with my... It was a home. Sunlight filtered through the leaves of an old oak tree, casting warm patterns on the wooden deck. I read the email. I did not reply. I highlighted the message, and I pressed delete. Some people fight back with screaming. Some fight back with tears. But the most dangerous women in the world fight back with patience. We let the arrogance of our enemies build the very scaffold they will hang from. We audit the betrayal. We prepare the documents. And we wait until the room is perfectly quiet before we strike the match. The ground beneath my feet was finally my own, and the view from where I was sitting was magnificent. if this story lit a fire in you, if you understand the quiet, immovable power of a woman who turn on notifications, because the stories worth hearing are about the invisible women who refuse to stay down when the world pushes them to the floor. See you in the next one.